Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm from the Healing Hands Duo, and today I'm going to be discussing whether or not vaccines are safe, so that you can make a more formally educated and unbiased decision on whether or not to vaccinate yourself and your children. I know this topic of conversation has been done 1,000 times before, but I felt it necessary to revisit this subject again because I still seem to be having discussions with people who are all for vaccines but have never been made aware of the information that I am about to discuss or disclose in this video. Again, Kevin and I are not here to battle, argue, or criticize the belief systems that you have been taught. We are simply here to present you with the information and research that we have collected over a decade due to our own personal experiences in regards to this topic. So with that said, let's get started. So the first argument that I often hear is that vaccines have completely eliminated certain diseases that we were plagued with in the past, and this is simply not true. In order to understand why we are no longer plagued by such diseases, it is absolutely imperative to understand the natural incline and decline of how viruses, parasites, and bacteria react within their physical environments. For example, think about the bubonic plague, better known as the plague labeled the Black Death. The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million in Eurasia and peaking in Europe in the years 1346 to 1353. The Black Death is estimated to have killed 30 to 60% of Europe's total population, or 1/3 of the world's population. How was it that the Black Death was almost fully eradicated? And I say almost, because no disease on this planet has ever been fully eradicated from this earth, either naturally or through medical intervention. So to say a disease no longer exists due to immunizations in itself is a complete lie. Most diseases decline naturally on their own. For the most part, the bubonic plague had almost fully been eliminated by the 14th century. But how was this so? If there were no vaccinations for that particular disease? They didn't even exist until the 18th century. Well, it disappeared like all other diseases, of course. Through the implementation of quarantines, reducing densely populated areas so that the disease could not spread easily, improved personal hygiene, cremations rather than burials to get rid of the infected bodies, and let's not forget the most important reason of all: viruses come and go naturally. The epidemic comes up, infection takes place, disease settles in, the body produces natural antibodies. Unfortunately, some will die due to weakened immune systems, and others will continue on their course of evolution with natural immunity, and that's pretty much the gist of it. And to say natural immunity does not exist on this planet, as I have heard some argue in the past, makes absolutely no sense, as the whole premise of how vaccinations are supposed to work was completely developed on the biochemistry of this model. For example, Edward Jenner's first vaccination. The doctor infects an 8-year-old James Phipps with cowpox in 1796. Jenner, who had been inoculated as an 8-year-old boy in 1757, was intrigued by the observation that milkmaids almost never contracted smallpox and inferred that their immunity to the disease could be a consequence of their exposure to the pustules on the udders of animals infected with cowpox. So basically, they had built up a natural immunity to the smallpox by being exposed to another virus with similar characteristics. So now that we have looked at how the Black Death was basically controlled and almost completely eradicated without the intervention of immunizations, let's look at how some more modern-day diseases that some of us have been led to believe have been eradicated by vaccines from the 19th century. So as you can see here, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, and measles manifested in and around the 1850s and had gone through a 90% natural decline between 1850 and the 1940s, when they decided they would implement mass immunizations for these viruses and then purportedly claim that the immunizations were entirely to thank for the eradication of these infectious diseases. We see this with smallpox in the 1850s, and what's even more scary in this chart is that the mass vaccination laws that were forced between the late 1860s to the 1870s not only were not responsible for the eradication of smallpox, but in fact caused roughly a 275% increase in the mortality from the disease. We see this again with respiratory tuberculosis, and the list just goes on and on. Also, some of the infectious diseases that they claim to be so horrible and life-threatening are usually played up by mainstream media, the pharmaceutical industry, and those that are quick to regurgitate what their general practitioners who have had very little training or education on vaccinology have told them. I mean, all I've been hearing about lately is how the unvaccinated have caused this recent measles outbreak epidemic, if you can even call it an epidemic. But what little are aware of is that the measles in most cases is not deadly if you have a well-functioning immune system. I mean, I know 3 people personally who have had the measles throughout their lifetime, one of which was a very close friend of mine who has had it twice, and all 3 of them are perfectly fine and are between the ages of 55 to 65 today. I heard someone say the other day that they wanted to mandate the chickenpox vaccination because the chickenpox can now be deadly. We all had the chickenpox. Walking across the street can be deadly. Which brings me to my next point. Anti-vaxxers don't know what they are talking about. They have formed their own opinions on pseudoscience and quackery. They have no formal education in this field of medicine, and you shouldn't listen to them because you should listen to your doctors because they know best. This argument by far has to be the one that upsets me the most because it is that fear-mongering that forced my mother all those years ago to vaccinate me so that I could go back to school, and which has probably contributed to the autoimmune disease that I and so many others are now suffering with due to negligence, misinformation, greed, and a GP whose education and medical degree were more than likely influenced by Big Pharma. Just look at this study here found on the PMC, U.S. National Library of Medicine in the National Institute of Health. A July 4th study in PLOS 1 ranked the rigor of Canadian medical schools in 2011 conflict of interest policies. A simple conflict of interest would be gifts, where drug companies provide pens, prescription pads, or lunches, while a more complex conflict of interest would be ghostwriting, where faculty members sign on as authors of studies conducted and written by pharmaceutical companies. Only 4 of the 17 schools scored higher than 50% in the study's parameters. So you can see here, Big Pharma has influenced our medical system at its core for their own personal gain, which in itself is a complete conflict of interest and cannot be trusted. And if that isn't enough to convince you that our educational system and other government-run establishments such as the CDC, the FDA, or Health Canada have been influenced by Big Pharma, let's just see what some real doctors say about the education that they received in medical school in regards to immunizations, shall we? Here's what Dr. Polevsky, medical doctor, board-certified pediatrician who received his medical degree from the New York University School of Medicine in New York City, had to say about his training in vaccines. When I went through medical school, I was taught that vaccines were completely safe and completely effective. I had no reason to believe otherwise. All the information that I was taught was pretty much standard in all the medical schools and the teachings and scientific literature throughout the country. I had no reason to disbelieve it. And it became clear to me as I read the research, listened to more and more parents, and found other practitioners who also shared the same concerns that vaccines had not been completely proven safe or even completely effective, based on the literature that we have today. It also came to my attention that there were ingredients in there that were not properly tested, that the comparison groups were not appropriately set up, and that conclusions made about vaccine safety and efficacy just did not fit the scientific standards that I was trained to uphold in my medical school training. Need another doctor's opinion? How about Dr. Susan Humphreys, medical doctor, board certified in nephrology and family medicine? Do you know how much doctors learn about vaccines in medical school? When we participate in pediatrics training, we learn that vaccines need to be given on schedule. We learn that smallpox and polio were eliminated by vaccines. We learn that there's no need to know how to treat diphtheria because we won't see it again anyway. We are indoctrinated with the mantra that vaccines are safe and effective, neither of which is true. Doctors today are given extensive training on how to talk to hesitant parents, how to frighten them by vastly inflating the risks during natural infection. They are trained on the necessity of twisting parents' arms to conform or fire them for their practices. Doctors are trained that nothing bad should be said about vaccines, period. How about Dr. Russell Blaylock, MD, a trained neurosurgeon who has combined many years of medical practice with the study of thousands of research studies to create his monumental books, who states in the following interview, which can be found here: "The problem they have now is a lot of good hard science is coming out showing that these vaccines are not safe, particularly due to the adjuvant aluminum compound. There is a group out of Vancouver, and these researchers have written several articles that are very powerful showing that this is not safe. There is also a group of immunologists that work with autoimmune disease that are showing that a number of autoimmune diseases are related to vaccinations." Which leads me to point number 3. Vaccines do not cause autism, autoimmune disease, or cancer. Can you show me one unbiased study that wasn't funded by the pharmaceutical industry that proves that vaccinated children are healthier than unvaccinated children? I know independent researchers, labs, and scientists have applied for grants to compare unvaccinated children in the Amish community with vaccinated children, and the government has downright refused to fund it, or any study for that matter that would compare the two. And why do you think that might be? Could it be because, as Dr. Blaylock states in his interview, that this study would infinitely prove that unvaccinated children are healthier and that over-inoculation is in fact destroying the immune systems of children, making them more susceptible to infections, which then fuels the panic for more vaccines? Since I have been diagnosed immunocompromised because I have Crohn's colitis, let's start with autoimmune diseases and immunizations, shall we? Here is an article in The Lancet on the case control study by Mark Finney and colleagues, which states the following. The study shows that for individuals born in the 1970s and vaccinated during their second year of life, no increased risk of developing Crohn's disease could be demonstrated during over 20 years of follow-up. Well, here is the first problem with this study, and I'll use myself as an example. This vaccine combination is usually administered at 12 to 15 months, and then again in some cases at the age of 18 months, which will they later state in this study is one of the only 2 reasons how the MMR could potentially cause the development of Crohn's disease in children. Here is the second problem with this study. They only followed these children for approximately 20 years. Well, I wasn't diagnosed with Crohn's disease for 25 years after my first immunization. And when it was discovered, I was forced into getting another MMR shot because I was told that my antibodies had worn off to the measles virus. Take a look here. We postulate that in the absence of maternal antibodies against measles and before the maturation of the child's immune system, during the immunological tolerance window, exposure to measles virus, be it wild or vaccine virus, could result in tolerance to measles antigen and therefore persistent infection. Individuals with tolerance to measles antigen would consequently be at high risk of Crohn's disease. Had I had a child right before I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease and wasn't carrying antibodies against the measles virus, which I wasn't, even though I had been immunized for it twice, who was then inoculated with the MMR before the age of 2, then I would have potentially put my child, and I quote this study, at high risk of Crohn's disease. Meet Dr. Brian S. Hooker, Focus for Health Board member and science advisor. He has a PhD, a PE, is an associate professor of biology at Simpson University in Redding, California, where he specializes in chemistry and biology coursework, and this is what he discovered. Dr. William Thompson, senior scientist at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, contacted me during 2013 and 2014 and shared many issues regarding fraud in the CDC, specifically regarding the link between neural development disorders and childhood vaccines. Dr. Thompson and I spoke on the phone more than 40 times over a 10-month period, and he shared thousands of pages of CDC documents with me. Eventually, Dr. Thompson turned this information over to Congress via Rep. Bill Posey of Florida. Among the issues discussed in the phone conversations were lies told to the public by the CDC regarding the link between thimerosal-containing vaccines and neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, as well as the link between the MMR vaccine and autism in African American males and the MMR vaccine and isolated autism. The article goes on to explain that Dr. Thompson's whistleblower attorney has stated that Dr. Thompson will now be publishing a paper in May 2016 where he will assert the MMR vaccine is not linked to autism in African American males. However, surprisingly enough, Dr. Thompson decided to write this reanalysis paper only after the following took place, which is also stated in this article. The CDC scientists colluded to cover up a relationship between the timing of the MMR vaccine and autism in African Americans that was first discovered in November of 2001. Rather than reporting the results to the public, all data regarding this relationship were destroyed at a secret meeting held sometime in August or September of 2002. Dr. Thompson attempted to warn the CDC director at the time regarding this relationship prior to the February 2004 Institute of Medicine meeting on vaccines and autism. Rather than allowing Dr. Thompson to present the information at this meeting, he was replaced as a speaker with Dr. Frank DeStefano, current director of the CDC's Immunization Safety Office, where he presented fraudulent results regarding the MMR vaccine and autism. Dr. Thompson was put on administrative leave and was threatened that he would be fired due to insubordination. When Dr. Thompson attempted to leave the CDC later that same year, he was given a $24,000 retention bonus. CDC officials were buying his silence through controlling his actions as a CDC employee. Dr. Thompson has published 2 papers linking thimerosal exposure in infant vaccines to ticks in boys. CDC fraudulently maintains on their website that there is no evidence of harm caused by the low doses of thimerosal in vaccines. Thimerosal. It must be okay in low doses, right? But what is classified as a low dose to an infant or even an adult for that matter? And what does the FDA have to say about it? And wait a minute, what about the other nasty preservatives that are used in vaccines like aluminum and formaldehyde? In 1927, Dr. Victor Vaughn, a toxicologist with the University of Michigan, testified before the Federal Trade Commission that all salts of aluminum are poisonous when injected subcutaneously or intravenously. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, aluminum is now being implicated as interfering with a variety of cellular and metabolic processes in the nervous system and in other tissue. In 1997, the New England Journal of Medicine published data showing that premature babies injected with aluminum build up toxic levels in the blood, bones, and brain, and that aluminum toxicity can lead to neurological damage, including mental handicaps at 18 months of age. What if I'm pro-life and I don't want to inject my child with a vaccine that was produced from an aborted fetal embryo? After all, couldn't that cause some type of immune response in my child that could possibly produce antibodies to human tissue or an overactive immune system? Anyway, if you weren't made aware of the fact that some vaccines are produced with aborted fetal embryos, you can read about this here. What if the vaccination is contaminated with viruses like SV40 that can cause cancer, which we saw back in 1955 to 1961, and then again in the 90s through an oral polio vaccination? What about all that stuff? But don't listen to me. Listen to them, the doctors, scientists, and vaccine developer who had done their own extensive research in regards to this topic.
All right, now what do you think of the vaccination?
You know, I have more concern about the vaccine than I do about the swine flu. It's including
thimerosal. It's an antiseptic preservative, and hasn't that been linked in some cases to autism?
It has, and in fact.
All right, would you give it to your kids?
I definitely would not.
And there's a great database, the VAERS database, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Very, very interesting. And I've looked at it. I mean, I'm a computer scientist, so I can go, look at the number crunching, looking at the words and what statistical distributions and whatnot. You can find a lot of things out from looking at VAERS. And one thing really striking is MMR. MMR is the vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella. And Andrew Wakefield connected that to autism.
what's this criminal, Rick Perry? Yeah, he is one of the biggest mass murderers, in my opinion, out there. But Rick Perry, who told everybody it's a law that they have to vaccinate their children, their daughters, against the human papillomavirus, HPV. First of all, it was never a law. But all these hundreds of thousands of young girls that got it will be probably infertile, but in 90% they will have cancer along the way. We have girls that dropped with a needle still in them.
The most important issue we have to face is this very serious issue about vaccines, because we believe that the vaccines are the way to program the immune system to protect us from environmental parasites, bacteria and viruses. And therefore we have bought into the system of artificially putting these antigens under our skin to invoke an immune response.
He went on to pioneer more breakthroughs in vaccine research and development than anyone in the history of American medicine.
Tell me how you found SV40 in the polio vaccine.
Well, that was a Merck thing. Yeah, I came to Merck, and I was going to develop vaccines. And we had wild viruses in those days. Remember the wild monkey kidney viruses and so forth? So I brought African greens, and I didn't know we were importing AIDS virus at the time. I don't know why to tell you this, but I've been around biology a long time. I just think this virus may have some long-term effects. And he said, what? I said, cancer. This meeting, and that was sort of the topic of the day, and the jokes that were going around was, gee, we would win the Olympics because the Russians would all be loaded down with tumors.
Merck will do to develop a vaccine.
We try to make a difference because I find it amazing, going through this 31-year career, how many health professionals will do things to you that they don't do to their children. I find this interesting. I asked the doctors, do you get all these shots that you're supposed to get? No.
Number 4, vaccines should be mandated to protect herd immunity. I think we should mandate that all individuals that are vaccinated with live viruses stay away from those that are vulnerable, such as those that are immunocompromised, children, and the elderly, due to the fact that they could be vaccine shedding. Live vaccines can in fact cause disease outbreaks. Let's take a popular one like polio, shall we? In about 98% of cases, polio is a mild illness with no symptoms or with viral-like symptoms. In paralytic polio, the virus leaves the digestive tract, enters the bloodstream, and then attacks nerve cells. Fewer than 1 to 2% of people who contract polio became paralyzed. Based on all the fear-mongering that surrounded the polio virus when I was growing up, I had always just assumed that polio was just as bad as the plague. Don't get me wrong, when I found out that polio was just a mild illness for most, and that only 1 to 2% of people who contracted it became paralyzed, I was probably just as surprised as you are right now. I was also surprised to read that scientists think that advances in hygiene paradoxically led to an increased incidence of polio in the 1900s because children were being exposed to the disease at a later age. So as you can see, being too sanitary, not allowing your children to acquire diseases naturally, and inoculating our kids for everything under the sun to try to build up immunity is just not the answer. In the book by Suzanne Humphreys, who is a medical doctor, and Roman Bystrianyk, entitled Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History, the chapter on the history of polio is a definite eye-opener. Many industrial chemicals are known to cause paralysis, which were mistaken for poliomyelitis. The healthcare industry had a very loose definition and acceptance criterion for what was poliomyelitis so that patients could get fast and easy treatment without actually testing for the presence of the polio virus. Chemicals such as lead, arsenic, and DDT can cause paralysis, which were mistaken as forms of the virus. DDT was sprayed excessively and extensively, even directly on children, clothing, and food. In mosquitoes, DDT immediately attacks the central nervous system, which causes paralysis, and shuts down the respiratory system, causing suffocation. In humans, this phenomenon takes a lot longer, over many repeated exposures to DDT, and causes the same symptoms, necessitating the use of an iron lung, or now a smaller respirator. After the release of the polio vaccine, the medical establishment tightened up the definition and acceptance criteria of poliomyelitis in an effort to claim eradication of the disease. So if you're still not convinced that vaccines can in fact injure children, especially with the number of vaccines that kids are being forced to get today as opposed to 30 years ago, and please don't make the argument that yes, a small number of children have been vaccine injured, but that's a small price to pay for the thousands that have been saved from immunizations. But what if you were asked to sacrifice your child for the greater good? Would you do it?